Hi, you guys. Welcome back to part three of History Tea with Professor T. We will continue here with more about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first 2 years in office. So, within his first 2 years of office, the 21st Amendment is passed. The 21st Amendment will repeal prohibition. So, once liquor and intoxicating beverages are able to be sold, they're also able to be taxed, right? So, also during FDR's first 2 years, we'll see the establishment of the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. The FCC oversaw U.S. broadcast airways and telephone communications. During the first 2 years of FDR's presidency, we'll also see the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which will regulate the stock and bond markets. So that's a little information about FDR and the first 2 years. Now, even though all of this New Deal legislation is being passed, it doesn't mean that these programs are permanent or that the court will agree with these programs. Now, at this time, even though FDR is a Democrat, the Supreme Court is still controlled by a lot of conservative Republican judges. And so they will start to invalidate some of these New Deal laws. So, one of the first that they will invalidate is the NRA. In Schechter versus the United States, the NRA is declared unconstitutional because, according to the court, it gave too much legislative power to the president by allowing him to regulate businesses that are local businesses that don't engage in interstate commerce. So, in that court case, the NRA will fall, the NRA will essentially fall because it will be declared unconstitutional because it gives the president too many legislative powers. Also, in United States versus Butler, another Supreme Court case, the Agricultural Adjustment Act will be declared unconstitutional because it will be seen as an unconstitutional exercise of congressional power over local economic activities. So it too will fail in January 1936. Now, just because people are getting jobs doesn't mean that there's no conflict at this time. Labor will see a pretty huge upheaval during the New Deal years. It's during this time that we will see the mobilization of millions of workers in mass production industries that will resist and fight unfair practices in the workplace. So at this time, it's really interesting because for one of the first times in American history, the federal government will be on the side of labor. Prior to this, usually the government would kind of play to the tune of big business. But during the New Deal years, during this time, the government will actually be on the side of labor. So that's pretty interesting. It's also during this time that American factories are kind of seen as they're kind of like dictatorships in miniature. So at this time, the government will actually be on the side of the worker. Now, these factories at the time, I say that they're like mini dictatorships because unions are very rare at this time. Workers could be beaten by supervisors, they could be fired at will, and management would determine the length of the workday and the speed of the assembly line. By 1934, there is an explosion in labor and it really hits its peak. In 1934, there are more than 2,000 strikes in that year alone. And it's during this time that we see the rise of the CIO. The CIO is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and it was created by the head of the United Mine Workers, John L. Lewis. Now, if we go back a couple of chapters, if you recall the American Federation of Labor or the AFL refused to create unions for industrial workers. And so the CIO will set out to create unions in the American economy. And they will really do this and they will revolutionize, I would say, the power of unions by introducing a tactic called the sit down, which is a striking tactic. The sit down was a strike tactic where workers would halt production, but they would remain inside the facility. And by remaining inside the facility, management could not bring in strike breakers. So the CIO and the unions that they will create will help to stabilize American employment. Now, from 1935 to 1936, we go through the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal, this phase of the New Deal, will focus on economic security. And so during the Second New Deal, we have the creation of the Rural Electrification Agency, or the REA. The REA has a goal of bringing electricity to homes in more rural areas. 80% of farms are still without electricity in 1934. So the REA, the goal of bringing electricity to these farms is that's a pretty huge goal. So the government would use low interest government loans to build electricity lines in more rural areas. Now, why do you think they were interested in bringing electricity to these more rural areas? What would be the benefit for the government for there to be more electricity in more homes? Now, while we like to think, well, it's just noble, so people can have light. It's also so these people can stimulate the economy. If you don't have electricity, you can't buy household appliances because they won't work in your home. And so the REA has a goal to bring electricity so people can stimulate the economy by buying household products, these products that are driven and powered by electricity. So it's really for economic stimulation. While it seems like this noble goal, like, yes, they're just going to bring light, let there be light to everyone in America, it's really so they can buy or stimulate the economy by buying household appliances. Because remember, the stock market isn't the economy. We are the economy. And every time we go to the store and we buy something, we are putting money into the economy. And so if people have electricity, they can now buy ice boxes, they can now buy stoves, they can buy all of these things, thus stimulating the American economy. Okay? So the next thing we'll talk about is the WPA. Well, the next things we'll talk about are the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the Wagner Act. So I'll start with the Works Progress Administration. The WPA will hire about 3 million Americans each year until it ends in 1943. The Works Progress Administration will hire Americans to construct public buildings, bridges, roads, airports, stadiums, and sewage treatment plants. So, this is another program that will put Americans to work and it will hire about 3 million Americans every year until it's dissolved in 1943. The Wagner Act will help to bring democracy to the workplace by empowering the National Labor Relations Board to supervise elections where employees voted on union representation. Okay, so the Wagner Act will help to bring democracy into the workplace by empowering the National Labor Relations Board to supervise elections where employees are voting on union representation to ensure that employees continue to have a voice. Another very important New Deal or piece of New Deal legislation is the Social Security Act of 1935. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a system of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, aid to the disabled, as well as elderly poor, and families with dependent children. The Social Security Act will also help to create our Social Security system, which is a hybrid of national and local funding and control and eligibility standards. States will pay for the most direct or will pay, I would say, most will pay for most direct poor relief. This was important and this is significant because it really is a radical departure from previous government policies. Prior to the New Deal, a lot of people thought that it was not the government's responsibility to aid the people. And as you can see, or as we talked about before in either part one or part two, in a previous part, we'll say. Um, One of the main criticisms of a lot of these New Deal projects is that it would create just a society of people who were dependent upon the government. So, this is a radical departure from previous government policies where you have the government stepping in to help people, the elderly poor, those who are disabled. It will provide a system to create old age pensions when you're no longer able to work. And it will also create a system that will help families with dependent children. So it's a pretty radical departure from previous government policies and previous administrations. Now, for FDR, freedom really meant greater security for the modern man. And he would link economic security, he'll link the idea, I would say, of freedom with economic security and saying that economic inequality was an enemy to freedom. Now, what makes this really interesting is that while he's saying that economic inequality was an enemy to freedom, a lot of these New Deal programs are discriminatory in their enforcement. African Americans are not able to be paid the same. They are excluded from many New Deal programs. Mexican Americans are also excluded from many New Deal programs. They are deported in mass, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Another thing that's really interesting about FDR, which makes him kind of different from his predecessors, is that FDR would also bring in the press about 2 times a week to really communicate to the American people. So it establishes a different type of relationship with the president and the American people. Now, while he does a lot, and there are a lot of programs, a lot of people are very critical of the New Deal because they felt that the New Deal employed reckless spending, reckless government spending, and they really felt that it undermined fiscal or financial responsibility. So there's a lot of criticism of the New Deal. FDR was elected in 1932. So in 1936, it's time for him to run again and either be, deposed or reelected. So FDR will win re-election in a landslide with more than 60% of the popular vote, and he will carry every state except for Maine and Vermont. This time period, this decade, the 1930s, will also represent a shift in political parties. So, with the Democratic platform, FDR was a Democrat. And he will really say that with the Democratic platform itself, the idea is that the government has an obligation to establish a democracy of opportunity for all people. Okay. So you'll see a departure, a definite shift in parties and a shift in platform. It's also during this period that for at least African Americans, let me see if I can find this specifically. In 1936, about 75% of all Black voters will support the Democratic Party platform. And so you see this shift or this departure from African Americans really supporting the Republican Party, which at this point, before that, had been known as the Party of Lincoln. You'll see a lot of African Americans shift to Democrat during the 1930s. Also, part of the Democratic platform was the idea of economic rights being a precondition of liberty. The Republican candidate, Alfred Landon, or as some people would call him, Alf Landon, really denounced Social Security, and that will kind of put the nail in his coffin. You're denouncing Social Security and other New Deal programs, and so he will lose pretty drastically. I'll say he will, again, FDR will win in a landslide with winning more than 60% of the popular vote and carrying every state except for Maine and Vermont. So let's go over some other Supreme Court cases and Supreme Court issues of this time. So we talked about the 21st Amendment, but we didn't talk about the 20th Amendment. The 20th Amendment moved the inauguration from March 4th to January 20th, which is where it is now. So from this point on, presidential inaugurations will be in January. Prior to this, the inauguration of presidents didn't take place until March. And so when I was talking about FDR's first 100 days in office, when I was like, oh, he passed this in March 1933, he passes those things as soon as he is in office, okay? FDR will also propose that the president be allowed to appoint a new justice for each one remaining on the court past the age of 70. The aim of this was to change the balance of power on the Supreme Court because during his first term, while FDR is passing all of this New Deal legislation, the Supreme Court was still pretty packed with conservative Republican judges who will overturn some New Deal legislation, such as the NRA and the AAA. The court, because of this, will also experience a political shift. They will affirm federal power to regulate wages, to regulate hours, as well as child labor and agricultural production. The end of the Second New Deal really comes with the Fair Labor Standards Bill, which is passed in 1938. The Fair Labor Standards Bill banned goods that were produced by child labor from interstate commerce, as well as it also set a 40-cent minimum wage, and it required overtime pay for any hours exceeding 40 hours per week. So it's a pretty drastic change. Again, the Fair Labor Standards Bill will ban goods produced by child labor from interstate commerce. It will set a 40-cent minimum wage, and it'll also require overtime pay for any work hours exceeding 40 hours per week. However, a year prior, the United States will experience an economic downturn, and unemployment, which had gone down to about 14%, will rise by another 6%. In 1937, the unemployment rate will go from 14% to 20%. It's also during this time that we get a lot of economic theory. And John Maynard Keynes has, in 1936, will write a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And in this, his theory of, I would say, successful economic growth is that large scale government spending is actually necessary to sustain purchasing power and to stimulate economic activity during economic downturns. Now, remember, during the New Deal, during the second New Deal, really even during the first, one of the criticisms that FDR will get is that he is employing or engaging in reckless government spending. But with this 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money by John Maynard Keynes, he will say that large scale government spending isn't reckless and it's actually quite necessary to sustain purchasing power and to stimulate the economy during economic downturns. So we've talked about a lot the alphabet soup, as I've called it, of the New Deal. Next, we will talk about how the New Deal affects women, how it impacts African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans. So, first, we'll talk about the New Deal and American women. The New Deal, or during the New Deal, many more women will be brought into the government in working roles, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt. She will change, or I will say, transform the role of the First Lady. She will be involved in the League of Women Voters. She will also form a woman's only or a women's only press corps. And she will also, so while FDR is pretty lukewarm on civil rights and civil rights policy, Eleanor Roosevelt will take more of a progressive stand on civil rights. And one of the things that she will do, for one, is fly with the Tuskegee Airmen. So if you are following with your slide presentation, on the next slide, you will see Eleanor Roosevelt with two Tuskegee Airmen. You'll see her seated in a plane because she does fly with Tuskegee Airmen, which also um, that I'll say that's it's pretty phenomenal during this time because she is a white woman flying with black men, which will eschew all sorts of sociocultural norms. But she did that to really show that not only are they apt at what they do, they are some of the best at what they do. After FDR dies, and we won't discuss his death in this course or in this chapter, but after FDR dies, Eleanor Roosevelt will actually serve as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations. She will also serve on the board of the NAACP. In 1934, she actually joins the NAACP and helped to get an anti-lynching bill to Congress. So Eleanor Roosevelt in the 30s will definitely transform the role of the First Lady. But yes, of course, more women will be appointed to roles within FDR's cabinet, including Mary McLeod Bethune, which we'll talk about in just probably about a minute or two. So, what about the New Deal and Native Americans? So, Commissioner or John Collier at this time is appointed as the Commissioner on Indian Affairs. He will, under John Collier, the Indian Emergency Conservation Program will be created, which was a civilian conservation corps type of project for reservations to help build up reservations. The Indian Emergency Conservation Program will end up employing more than 85,000 Native Americans. So it will also, like the CCC, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, it will put thousands of young people to work in helping to rebuild reservations. It's also under John Collier that the policy of forced assimilation in boarding schools will end during the New Deal, which will allow Native Americans to have some cultural autonomy. Instead of having these schools will be replaced with schools on reservations. And so it's also during this New Deal time or during the New Deal that there is increased spending on Native American health. Some historians will say that the New Deal and Native Americans was really one of the only kind of bright spots for minorities during the New Deal because there were some changes. And a lot of that is due to John Collier and his work with the Indian Emergency Conservation Program and and ending the policy of forced assimilation. Now, what about the New Deal and Mexican Americans? So, the Great Depression was incredibly difficult for Mexican Americans. More than 400,000 Mexican Americans are either returned or, I would say more accurately, were deported to Mexico, even though many of them were actually citizens of the United States by birth. So if we go back to the 14th Amendment said that anyone who was born in the United States was a citizen of the United States. However, even though hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans were citizens by birth, it didn't stop the United States from forcibly deporting them. Those who remained in the United States worked in grim conditions in California's vegetable and fruit fields. Now, some will seek greater rights by claiming to be white Americans. Now, let me stop here and say they're not claiming to be culturally white, okay? It's more of a legal classification of whiteness because even in the 1920s and 30s, people understood that whiteness came with its own set of privileges. So, not just Mexican Americans, but other ethnic Americans will seek to have a legal identity of white because even they knew back then that whiteness had its privileges. And if you were identified as Black, you lost or you did not have privileges. But even before the Great Depression, there was, for Mexican Americans, there was a lot of intense pressure from the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, to reduce Mexican immigrants. Mexican born Texans, the population during this time was reduced by about a third. The Los Angeles Mexican population lost about or Los Angeles lost about a third of its Mexican population as well. While some Mexican Americans were hired by the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, a lot of them did not qualify for a lot of New Deal programs due to residency requirements. So while some Mexican Americans are helped by New Deal programs, a lot of them are not helped by New Deal programs, and many are forcibly deported to Mexico, even though they are citizens by birth. Now, what about the New Deal for African Americans? So, W.E.B. Du Bois at this time will call on Blacks to organize for economic survival by building an independent, cooperative economy within their own segregated communities and to gain control of their own separate schools. He is doing this because there aren't many programs that are helping African Americans. Now, FDR will appoint Mary McLeod Bethune to the advisory committee of the National Youth Administration, and she will do some work with helping to fund Black schools during the Great Depression and during this era of the New Deal. So that is something that is a plus. However, most New Deal programs were discriminatory against Black people. That most New Deal programs will discriminate against Black people. Their pay scale will be lower on projects. The Civilian Conservation Corps, while they will hire them to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps camps, they will be segregated camps. And the FHA will refuse to guarantee mortgages for Black borrowers. So, this is where your chapter ends. Next chapter, we'll talk about World War II, and we'll talk about what the U.S. does to prepare for World War II. Again, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments, or if you're a student of mine, just send me an email and I will get back with you guys as soon as possible. I hope you enjoyed chapter 21.